Yeah, and like Steve was saying, a great way to learn is to join our site visit leaders, because we will pair you with somebody that's pretty knowledgeable. You're not expected to go out and give the advice if you don't feel qualified, that sort of thing. But we'll pair you with somebody who has a lot of experience, and um, but it's a great way to learn as well. So we invite you to join our chapter and take part in those site visits. But another great way to learn is just to come to our monthly programs. Uh, Rosalind's already given a little bit of a spiel on, why is it this advancing? Okay, okay. I wonder if that was to deal with the clicker. So I won't go into too much detail. Yep, that was it on our chapter. But yeah, we are nationwide, and we do have monthly programs. For some of these programs are going to include some yard tours. In the fall, we have our native seed swap, free and open to the public. You don't have to come with seed to walk away with seed. At least the past 2 years, that's been the case. There's been enough native seed brought that people have collected from their gardens, that there's more than enough for everybody. And then at least I've been lucky enough to get all the leftovers. So I go home with bags and bags of seeds, and my wife is just like, oh my goodness. Uh, we had a chapter journal for the past few years since we started in 2020, right before COVID. However, we've been talking about transitioning that over to a blog. So those blog articles will be on our website once we get up and going, and then getting on our email list with our monthly or potentially bi-monthly email. We'll include some articles or links within that email. Also, if you join, you get access through our national office through webinars. We have everything. Some are free. Some, ones that we partner with New Designs for the American Landscape, you get a discounted price on. So, I mean, a lot of great resources, not just through our chapter, but when you join, you get access to those national resources that our national office provides as well. And then there's the national journal that you get also. And then plenty of online resources. Our chapter website, ozark.wildones.org. There's a tab called Learn, all kinds of great information, plant lists for different site conditions. You can see our back issues of our journal on the website. There's a list of places where you can purchase native plants in the area. We have a list of businesses in the area that specialize in native plant landscaping. We're also looking for adding as many as we can. So if you know of anyone that we didn't capture in our list, please reach out. We'd love to include any landscaping businesses or nurseries or growers that specialize in native plants. One reason we exist is to just promote native plants and get more out there on the landscape. And then our national website also has online resources. Through our national organization, national level, we have the Seeds for Education grant program. So if you have a native plant garden that in any way is involved with kids under the age of 18, whether they be, I think a requirement is they have to be involved in planting it, or maintaining it, then there's that Seed for Education grant that you can apply for. There's a limited number of grants, so they review all of those, and then we'll distribute the funds after they've made decisions. But we're just trying to encourage the youth and the next generation and trying to find ways to fund these educational opportunities on the importance of native plants, and especially in schools where these can be used as ecology lessons for science classes, gardening, horticulture, all sorts of stuff. Just, a really great program. So anyway, won't spend too much time on these slides, but we're going to start pretty basic. This is native plant gardening 101. So I like to treat it like you're coming in here, like, what is a native plant? So what is a native plant? What makes a plant native to a region? And that's not a very simple thing to define. You like in many things in science, you can come up with a definition, but then you're going to find an anomaly that just makes that definition not work, right? So for the purpose of this presentation, we're going to consider a plant native when it's growing in the region in which it evolved. That's a pretty broadly worded statement. I mean, under that, you could say that, ginkgo biloba is a native plant because it did evolve here in North America millions and millions of years ago. But since then, sometime in the distant past, its range was restricted to Asia, right? So it's not really part of the local ecosystem. It hasn't been here in North America in the relatively geological past to be part of the local ecosystem here. And so really the importance of using native species is because they are part of the local ecosystem. Native plants provide nectar for pollinators, such as hummingbirds, butterflies, moths. We don't have any pollinating bats in this part of the country, but other places like in the Southwest, some bat species pollinate cacti, things like that. But basically, native plants are they're the conduit, right, for the energy from the sun to come into the ecosystem on Earth, right? They're trapping that sun's energy through photosynthesis, building biomass, and then other things eat the plants, and that's how energy enters the ecosystem here. So many species, almost all species, rely in some way, whether directly or indirectly, on native plants to live or complete their life cycles or reproductive cycles. For example, monarch butterflies. We've seen a significant decline in monarchs over the past several decades, and that's a lot because their habitat is being removed due to land use changes, due to the more that we are taking native prairies and where there are milkweed populations that these monarchs rely on and converting these to, parking lots or farm fields, agricultural fields, or even pastures for grazing, where we're replacing the milkweeds with pasture grasses. And so, monarchs, in case you aren't familiar with their life cycle, within the central flyway that we live along, they spend the winter. So right now they're in this mountain range in Mexico overwintering. And then when things start to warm up in the spring, they start to head north. And they rely on milkweed plants as their nursery for their eggs. So they find a milkweed plant, lay their eggs on it. Those eggs turn into caterpillars. Those caterpillars start to eat that milkweed, and then it will turn into a chrysalis and then eventually hatch and become that next generation of monarch that then continues to head north and continue that journey. And so it's like 3, 4, or 5 generations of that monarch does each year. Basically, it leaves Mexico, heads all the way up to the northern United States around Great Lakes, Chicago. If you go up to Chicago in the summertime, you'll see monarch butterflies in that area, especially where they have milkweeds and native plants planted and some native gardens up there around the Field Museum and stuff like that. Through here, they're usually migrating through in the spring, and then they come back through in September. But that monarch that leaves in the early spring is not the same monarch that comes back in the following fall. It's like the great grandchild of that monarch. So this is a multi-generational journey that happens each year, which is fascinating. How do these monarchs know how to do that each year? So, but they rely on the presence of these milkweed species along their migration routes. And so whenever we change the landscape and remove these milkweeds, they don't have those nurseries to lay their eggs on. And so you end up with a decline in monarch populations. And that's why the monarch is now a candidate for listing as a threatened or endangered species for federal protection because there's just been so much of an impact. Another example, bobwhite quail. Who remembers hearing bobwhite quail 30, 40 years ago? I mean, you hardly ever hear them anymore unless you're just in an area with a lot of their habitat. And that's just because of a lot of our land use changes. We're changing the landscape to be good for humans and the things we like to grow. But we're forgetting that we exist within an ecological context that supports us. I mean, we get a lot of free ecosystem services from pollinators. I mean, millions or maybe even billions of dollars that they estimate that we get for free from pollinators for our crops, pollinating crops. And so that helps keep our food affordable. If we had to hire people to go out and pollinate all of our crops, food prices would likely increase significantly. So in short, native plants are part of that web of life. So I've always enjoyed this quote by John Muir: when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. And so there is this broader web of life. And I've always kind of considered native plants as like that hub, that everything seems to tie back to, or it's like the base where everything is dependent on. Like I said, it's the conduit where the energy from the sun is taken and converted into the energy that we use in the ecosystem, the food we eat, everything else. We are supported by native plants ultimately. So when we plant native species in our gardens and our landscapes that have been replaced by a parking lot or a subdivision, we're not replacing what was originally there. It will never be what it used to be, but we are helping to reweave some of those threads of the web of life back into the built and landscaped environment. If a native prairie were to be converted to a subdivision like we're currently seeing in Northwest Arkansas. I mean, consider how much of, I think from Fayetteville all the way to Prairie Grove used to be a huge prairie ecosystem. There's a remnant of it at Woolsey Wet Prairie, Chesney Prairie out near Siloam Springs. Rogers, Bentonville, Centerton were once a giant prairie, and the remnant now is Searles Prairie, which you can see out on Hudson and Rogers. And you can go visit that tiny little remnant of what this whole area used to be like. And so, you know, it won't have the level of biodiversity that we once had, but if you can plant some milkweeds, plant some pollinator species, you might attract some of those butterflies. Well, what eats caterpillars primarily? I mean, caterpillars are a huge food source for birds, especially small songbirds and passerines. I mean, so much nutrients and protein are packed into a tiny little morsel that they have to expend a lot less calories to get a caterpillar than they do to try to meet that same caloric intake with aphids. And so finding a caterpillar, especially when they're trying to feed a nest of hatchlings, they really do prioritize those caterpillars. So once you learn that, you'll see that the return on investment is pretty quick. You plant some native species in your yard. That year, I mean, it's literally that year, you're going to start to see butterflies. And when you have butterflies and you're supporting caterpillars, you're going to start to see birds. So maybe you don't care about butterflies, but you like birds. You like attracting birds to your yard. Well, plant some native plants. You know, these are natural bird feeders. They're going to either the seeds themselves are going to provide the food for the birds, because they're, you know, native plants do provide food for birds as well, but they're also going to attract other food for birds like the insects and whatnot. So some other benefits of using native species, most, not all, but many native species have these deep root systems. And so especially these perennial species. Now, annual species only live 1 year, so their roots don't have enough time to really get very deep. They stay pretty shallow. But these perennial species grow these deep root systems, and they reach very deep into the ground, and they're able to help pull up stormwater that help, no, not stormwater, groundwater that helps them get through those dry summer months. So if you think about it, like these plants are already adapted to our local climate and environment. Nobody had to go out and water the woods or water the prairie before humans came along, right? I mean, this isn't something that nowadays we have to spend so much of our irrigation and water use watering our lawns during the hot, dry summer months because those grasses aren't adapted to our climate. So when we plant native species, I'm not going to tell you they're no maintenance because they do require maintenance, but they are low maintenance. So they require less watering. These deeper root systems also help facilitate more stormwater infiltration into the soil profile. And so that helps recharge groundwater supplies. You know, groundwater supplies are going to help keep recharging intermittent streams during the drier months. So that's a source of water in some of our local streams, is water coming from the water table. So as long, you know, if we're not recharging the water table, then our streams will dry up quicker or for longer periods of time, at least the intermittent classified streams, during the dry summer months. So groundwater recharge, lower water usage required. These are all benefits that that native plants provide. Also, you know, a lot of the invasive species that we contend with today originally came in as, you know, plants that were being used for one reason or another. You know, kudzu, ornamental or erosion control, Japanese honeysuckle. I mean, who loves the smell of Japanese honeysuckle in the springtime or summertime? I do. I remember as a kid taking apart the flowers and tasting them. I loved it. And I was so heartbroken when I learned that these things were so horrible for the ecosystem because I love them. I can totally understand why somebody 100 years ago or however long ago wanted to plant that, you know, along their fence row. But unfortunately, it really does. They don't have these natural competitors. It's not from this ecosystem. And so it doesn't have the natural checks on its population. Not enough things are eating it to keep it from getting out of control and throwing things out of balance. That's the problem with not all non-native species, but the ones that become what we call invasive. They they throw things out of balance because they don't have those checks on their growth, and they just tend to take over. Like you've seen with kudzu, it will take over an entire area and smother and shade everything out. Japanese honeysuckle can do the same thing. So by using native species, we are by default not using non-native or potentially invasive species, right? So, and there are also a lot of native alternatives to many of the typically non-native invasive species that have been out there on the landscape. Some example of these non-native or invasive species include the Bradford pears, heavenly bamboo, Japanese honeysuckle, some of the ones I've already talked about. But I encourage you to go out and kind of learn, and our site visit committee too can help you figure out if you what a species on your property might be, and if it's invasive, and if so, what's the best way to get rid of it or to control it. So, a little bit on how do we design a native plant garden? What sorts of things do we need to be thinking about if we want to plant native species in a landscape? How do we go about this? So some general things you want to consider. First of all, where does that species like to grow in the wild? And some of that, of course, is going to be dependent on how familiar you are with that species in its natural setting. Not everybody's that familiar, and I understand that. That's why we're here to help you. But if you are familiar, if you're, like identifying species while you're out hiking, that sort of thing, using your iNaturalist app, which, by the way, a program next month on the Diana project, given by Sean Hunter, and was also co-founded by Curtis there on the front row. Raise your hand, Curtis. Ms. Hunter is going to give a program on the Diana project, which just ties into what we're talking about. Diana butterflies is our Arkansas state butterfly, and I won't give away too much of her presentation, but their host plant are violets. And so a lot of land use here in Northwest Arkansas has resulted in the fact that we have not seen a Diana fritillary in this region, and she'll probably have a date for us. But it's pretty much been extirpated from our region because a lot of people are spraying violets in their lawns and that sort of thing. So anyway, so where does a species like to grow naturally? What sort of soil moisture is typically found there? Are we talking about a place next to a pond, a stream bank, high up on a hill? What about sunlight? Is it like a wide open area? Do you find it underneath the forest canopy in a woodland or open woodland? And then soil pH. What kind of things factor into soil pH? Well, around here in the Ozarks, a lot of times, what plants are going to be growing somewhere, and also the bedrock or material. So things like glades that have sandstone bedrock or tend to have a lower pH soil. So you find a different plant community in these glade habitats than you have where a glade might have dolomite bedrock material, which is going to impart more of a calcareous or a little bit higher pH to the soil. And so that's one thing about these glade ecosystems is depending on what the bedrock is, you get a different plant communities. Also, pine groves. We see a lot of blueberries, wild blueberries growing under in pine groves. And that's a lot of because these pines are not very good at base cycling. They are. So these soils tend to be lower pH than other areas. And as anyone who's grown blueberries just in their garden, you know that they like to have a little bit lower pH than most soils. And so typically pine forests don't have a whole lot growing underneath them, but blueberries are one of those species that do just fine. So usually around June is when those are ripe and ready for picking if you ever are interested in finding some wild blueberries. So soil moisture, how can we find out some information about the soil moisture that a plant prefers? And I just want to give a reference out there, an easy website to remember, or at least easier than if you want to go to the source, which is at the bottom. But plants.usda.gov. If you go to that website, you can type in the name of a plant and it'll give you some information on that species. And on that website, you can see here I've used white oak as an example, Quercus alba. And there's a tab called the wetland tab, and it has what's called the wetland indicator status of a species. And these were all developed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for people that do wetland delineations and for regulatory purposes, since wetlands are protected by the Clean Water Act. So if you want to go to the source of where this information is, there's a much longer website, wetlands-plants.usace.army.mil. That one's a little harder to remember, but plants.usda.gov. Go to that wetland tab on a species, and it will have a few different regions that plant is known to occur in with these different indicator statuses. And I'll talk about these here in just a little bit, but just know for right now that right here in Fayetteville, we are in the Eastern Mountains and Piedmont region. They've lumped us in with the Appalachians because our climate and our topography and everything else here is very similar. Our soils, everything else. If you are in the eastern or southern part of the state, you would be considered to be in the Atlantic and Gulf coastal plain region. And many times, like you see here with white oaks, it has the same wetland indicator status in all these regions, but sometimes there is some variation. So it's always good to know where you're planting your garden, what sort of wetland indicator status does that plant have in your region. And so there are 5 statuses total, ranging from upland, which are very dry, well-drained sites, all the way down to an obligate wetland species. So if it says UPL, this is something that's going to like well-drained areas that stay dry. They aren't flooded at all. I think I might have okay, yeah. So here's a little diagram showing the landscape of each of these indicator statuses. So facultative upland, you see out there on the outer edges, that is above that high water mark. So during a 100-year storm or these rainy times, a creek may come up, it never gets up into that facultative upland area, right? But a facultative species, they can handle that periodic wetness. So they're generally going to be in a dry area that's not sitting in water. But during a heavy rain event, you might have the water level come up, and it might get that area, that soil saturated. Now, typically some plants have limits to how much inundation they can take, but facultative species are going to be generally able to handle some of that periodic wetness. Now you move closer, you see this facultative wetland species. These are able to not only handle that high water mark, but they also kind of start to dip down into that average water area. So a lot of riparian species that are low down in the hollers right next to a creek, you'll notice are going to be commonly facultative wetland species. Now, when we say facultative wetland, they're not all only in wetlands, right? We're just trying to figure out how much water can they handle. Versus an obligate wetland species, OBL, these are things like your cattails, buttonbush, these things that like to be right at the water's edge or in the water. They grow in mud flats, things like bald cypress, that sort of thing. So they're in where the water is normally. But when that low water happens during the summer, things start to dry up. Maybe that pond, the edge of the water kind of shrinks. That would be, like a mud flat area. That's where the obligate wetland species like to hang out. And so when you get into too deep a water habitat, this is where your soil rooted plants aren't going to be able to grow. And that's where you're looking at aquatic species that have floating roots. But generally, those areas, mostly you don't see a whole lot growing. That's kind of where the vegetation will stop. What's generally referred to as a deep water habitat. And so this is understanding these species and how it characterizes where they like to be on the landscape can be helpful. And I will say this applies mostly to a wild natural habitat. There are some species that are considered obligate wetland species that in a garden setting, like swamp milkweed, can do just fine in an area that would be a little more considered facultative or facultative upland. As long as we're giving it enough water, it's usually able to, and we're removing its competition, it's usually able to put a taproot down and do just fine in this sort of environment. However, in the wild, it's not able to compete with other species in that environment. So now a cattail you couldn't plant unless you're really giving it a lot of water, but then why are you planting cattails like that? So just a little information there. So, okay, yeah, I tend to hang out on that slide and then I say all of these slides. So I'll just skip through these. Sunlight duration. Well, how can we figure out what a species likes as far as sunlight? Well, we want to know its native habitat, of course, like I mentioned earlier. So plants that are going to prefer this full sun are going to be those species that in a natural habitat like to grow out on prairies and glades, these areas that are open and receive sun all day long. So where might you plant a prairie species on your property? Well, if you have a wide open area that's not going to be shaded, even part of the day, that's going to be optimal. South-facing slopes. We're in the northern hemisphere, right? So the south-facing slope, the sun's slightly to the south, not completely above us year-round, right? Slightly to the south. So a south-facing slope generally is going to get more sun than a north-facing slope, which has a lot more shade. That's why we see a lot more mesic forest habitats on the north slopes in the Ozarks. Mesic meaning moist or wet. So because it has shade, there's less evaporation of soil moisture. And so a lot of times higher up on the slopes on the north side, you might see some facultative wetland species like spicebush. It's not that uncommon. South side of a house or building is going to get a lot more sun than your north side. So what are some native flowers that like these full sun environments? That includes things like tick-seed sunflower. Now, ignore the common names. Native plants have an issue with common names sometimes. Tick-seed sunflower. That just refers to their seeds being small, tiny, and black, and they can look like seed ticks. But, don't let that turn you off. It's a beautiful flower. Compass plant, Coreopsis species, and some of our milkweeds like spider milkweed, butterfly milkweed. Purple coneflower or pale purple coneflower does much better. It's more of a glade or a open prairie coneflower. Spiderworts, birdfoot violet. Now some native grasses, switchgrass, eastern gamma grass. Both of these, especially eastern gamma grass, you can see that a lot out in wet prairie areas, like at Woolsey Wet Prairie on the west side of Fayetteville. Bleak blue stem Indian grass. These are some of our native warm season grasses, provide a lot of great habitat for wildlife. Shrubs include common button bush. You can see a lot of that out at Woolsey Wet Prairie. Also, false indigo bush, also known as lead plant, facultative wet species, something that likes these wet habitats. You see a lot growing along stream banks, pond edges, and wet prairies. Native vines that like full sun. Maybe you have a fence around your garden. This is a great place for using this as a trellis for like a native vine. Wild potato vine, which is one of our native morning glory Ipomea species. Purple passion flower. Beautiful. I mean, look at that flower. I mean, it looks like it doesn't belong here. And it's because a lot of the other Passiflora species, which is a genus that this species is in, or in South America and Central America. Like when you eat passion fruit or something that's like passion fruit juice, or that's that same genus. So we do have a couple of North American species, the most common one being purple passion flower, Passiflora incarnata. And so the fruit is edible and delicious. And also there's a lot of good medicinal properties of the species, but that's a different talk. And native plants for full sun or partial sun. Now, some of these species, especially ones that live in prairies, can handle the occasional being shaded out. Sometimes a tree might, shoot up in a prairie. Some of these are also adapted to these savanna habitats. Long time ago, there was savannas when the earth was a lot drier. There was a dry period in the Cenozoic era that when grasses evolved, and this was when there's a lot of savanna habitat. So what are savannas? This is like where you have a prairie, but trees kind of dotting the landscape, right? An open forest or woodland, you're going to have a little more canopy coverage, but it looks like a forest where the trees are spread out and there's gaps in the canopy. So there's still sunlight getting in. So you get partial sun during different parts of the day as the sun moves across the sky. If you're on the east or west side of something that's obstructing the sun, like a building or a tree or a bluff, you'll get shade for part of the day, sun for another part of the day, right? So these are other locations. This is other things to consider where you might plant some of these species. It might do well on one east or west side of your house or building. So plants that do well in either full or partial sun can include a wild strawberry. When we moved out to our property, we had there's a lot of wild strawberries were already out there, and they are delicious. They fruit in June. And I'm not talking about the false wild strawberries, which often get mistaken because they look a little closer to our domestic variety. But the true wild strawberries taste just like a store-bought strawberry, just without all the flavorless white part in the middle that you get from the store-bought one. It's all the good stuff packed into a tiny little strawberry. Rattlesnake Master. I remember a friend of mine told me once that she thought that Rattlesnake Master would be an awesome name for a heavy metal band. And I was like, yeah, I agree. Now, wild quinine, shooting star, flowering spurge, a lot of these beautiful species that can be used just like any other species in your garden. Blue-eyed grass. You see that blue flower there on the far left? That's actually, it's called blue-eyed grass because unless it's in flower, it's easily mistaken for a grass. It's actually iris. So it's a monocot, just like the grasses are. And so the blades are very long. The leaves are very grass-like. The veins run parallel. It's just like any other monocot. But when it flowers, it's not a grass, it's an iris. Violet wood sorrel, cardinal flower. These are all examples of species And I got to be careful because I get talking too much on some of these and end up running a little long. So I'm trying to move through a little quickly on some of these species. We'll be talking about a lot of species throughout this whole presentation. And I'm also happy to send out the slides. If anyone would like to request them later, feel free to reach out and I'll send these to you. So that way you don't have to worry about trying to get a photo of every slide you want to. Native shrubs. I included eastern redbud in this. I mean, it's technically a tree, an understory tree. But American beautyberry, fragrant sumac, these are all shrubs that can handle full sun, partial sun. Rusty blackhaw, great, has beautiful leaves, change beautiful colors in the fall, has these beautiful white flowers in spring, usually around April or May. And then some pretty nice, cool looking fruit that's edible. Foragers refer to them as wild raisins because they shrivel up on the plant and they can be eaten in the wintertime and fall. American wisteria. We have our own native species of wisteria here in North America that doesn't get out and take over or get too invasive like a lot of the Chinese wisteria does. That is beautiful. I mean, whenever Chinese wisteria is in bloom, you know, it's definitely beautiful. But unfortunately, ecologically, especially whenever land use is getting to be so changed as our population grows, I just don't know that we can afford. I mean, every little bit of land has it's getting strangled out. So we just got to be very conscious of making sure that what we're putting out there is able to support the ecosystem. Trumpet honeysuckle, like we have native honeysuckles. You know, so I mean, there's several species of native honeysuckles, and they're all very beautiful. This trumpet honeysuckle, hummingbirds love it. I mean, their beaks are perfectly adapted to those long flower types. They're red. Notice how, you know, hummingbird feeders, you know, are red, little yellow in the middle. They you know, so they're hummingbird magnets. So, you know, if you're tired of replacing the stuff in your hummingbird feeder and having to clean it out to keep, you know, from mold and all that sort of stuff, plant some trumpet honeysuckle. You know, it's a lot lower maintenance than your hummingbird feeder, and go to enjoy those hummingbirds. Now, what about plants that don't do well in any sun at all, prefer that partial sun? I mean, not any sun at all, but don't do well in full sun, but just partial sun. These are going to be those species adapted to open woodlands, forest edges, you know, where they, you know, there's no full sun because it's always being blocked out for part of the day. You know, so east or west side of your building or somewhere where you know it's going to get some shade through part of the day is going to be important for these species. If you have a wet area near a creek, you know, or a pond, you might be familiar with spotted jewelweed. You know, it's also known as touch-me-not. Those seeds, they disperse themselves by that explosion kind of method. So as it grows, it's got this coil that tightly wounds up, and when it's ripe and you just barely bump it, that it uncoils and it flings the seeds everywhere. So it's fun for kids and adults too, to sit there and, you know, touch them and watch them, you know, the seeds just popping everywhere. And you know, and you're helping it disperse its seeds because that's what it was designed to do. It was designed to disperse them that way when it's been bumped into. Mountain mints, mist flowers, downy phlox. A lot of our ferns, like these shady areas. Deerberry, that's one of our wild vaccinium species, or which is the blueberry genus. Flowering dogwood. Strawberry bush. You know, hearts of bustin is a common name for that strawberry bush. So very beautiful fruit on that. Red buckeye, another hummingbird magnet. Virginia creeper. Now this is one that will, you know, it likes these shady areas or partial shade, so it can kind of take over an area. But keep in mind, if you have trouble getting anything to grow in that shady area, this might be a perfect for a ground cover. It's also a host plant for different species of moths. I'm not sure about butterflies, maybe, but I know when I was looking up a certain moth caterpillar, I found Virginia creeper was its host plant. Dutchman's pipe vine, that flower looks like a pipe. It's also the host plant for the pipe vine swallowtail butterfly. We'll talk about host plants here in just a little bit too. So plants that like full shade, these are going to be plants adapted to that forest environment where the canopy is pretty much closed throughout the day and it stays shady. So if you have a north side of your building that stays shaded throughout the day, or if you're on a north facing slope that's not getting any sun, these might be better species. Now, because they like these shadier areas, they tend to be more adapted to a little more fertile soil. So they might require, you know, make sure that you're putting some wood chips or something down to hold that soil moisture in. But rue anemone, wild geraniums, dwarf crested iris, which is my favorite native wildflower, is what got me hooked into identifying plants out in the wild. First time I took a field guide out, I started off as just a high-vid hiker and backpacker, but I wanted to know what can I eat while I'm out there? How can I learn how to bring less with me and have less, just, use less and be able to go further and stay longer and have less impact. And so, I started bringing a field guide, just figure, well, you got to learn what's out there first, and then you learn what's edible and how to identify it, what parts are edible. Well, then, it happened to be a trip. I was, just on my own one weekend out the K Park Cemetery access to the Upper Buffalo Wilderness area. And that weekend, the dwarf crested irises were just on blast, just everywhere in bloom, constantly, beautiful, blowing my mind. So I was like, what are these? So I looked it up, and it pulled me in, it hooked me. So it's like, I'm just got attached to plants in general. And so, whether I can eat them or not, now I love plants. I love to identify them. I spent so much time that weekend, just, when you're by yourself, you don't have a whole lot to do. You can bring a book, or you can just lay there and look on the forest floor and, stare at these flowers up close and in detail. And it was just a life-changing experience, to say the least. And so as I learned more about native plants and other benefits they have, and then, just it became a whole passion.
Remember approximately what time of the year that was?
April. Yep. Again, strawberry bush, northern spice bush, likes these shady environments. All right, so but we're trying to use a landscaped environment, trying to make it appealing. Maybe you have neighbors that don't really want to see a wild, unkempt garden, right? So what are some things you can do to help it stay looking nice? Well, grouping same species together, is just more appeasing to the eye, appealing to the eye, because it draws your eye where there's a cluster of purple coneflower over here, a cluster of wild quinine over here, versus it all being mixed in together, where it's a little more homogeneous. Having these groupings can be, it just makes it looks better. You want to understand when is the bloom period for that species. Some species are only going to bloom in the spring. Some are only going to bloom in the late spring, early summer. Others aren't going to bloom until the late summer, or there's a few out there that won't bloom until October. And so you want to, consider that as you're planting stuff, because if you want color year round, you want to have a variety of different bloom periods. Floral layering. So, there's going to be some short species. There's going to be some taller species. Usually the ones that bloom early on in the year are going to be shorter because they haven't had a whole lot of time to grow. Things that bloom later in the year are usually taller because they've been growing all growing season, and blooming is something they do at the very end of the year. So maybe sticking the taller season or taller species in the back, shorter ones around the edges, or the taller ones can be in the center of something you could walk around, or against the back of the fence, that sort of thing. Annuals versus biennials and perennials. The perennials are going to be the ones that are going to live they're going to come back each year. Now there are long-lived perennials and there are short-lived perennials. Short-lived perennials may only live a few years. Annuals live 1 year. So 1 year they go from seed, they germinate, they grow, they flower, they put out their seed, and then they die. Annuals, they die back each year down to the root systems, but those root systems overwinter and then create new growth the following year. Biennials live 2 years. A lot of the members of the carrot family are biennials. So annuals, they tend to produce a lot of seed. That's their adaptation strategy to making sure there's more of their species later on. And they're also not going to stay in the same place. They're going to move around each year depending on where that seed lands. But because they produce a lot of seed, they can a lot of times outcompete or outshade other things. So just things to consider. You don't want to overdo the annuals, and you might want to stick with perennials, say, if you want more consistency throughout year to year. But another thing to consider is those annuals are going to give you flowering that first year. A lot of perennials will take 2, maybe 3 years before you really start to see them take off and start doing well and flowering. But during that time, just because you're not seeing it do much, it's working on its underground root system and getting that going and established. All right, so what are some ideas for home garden projects? How are we doing on time? 11 o'clock. Okay. We started a little late. Not trying to move forward a better clip. Rain gardens. So this is great for stormwater. What are rain gardens? These are these shallow constructed depressions that can collect stormwater off your roof or from an impervious surface like a parking lot, driveway, street, that sort of thing. We can plant these with native species. You generally would want to go with those facultative species because those are the ones that can handle those high water times, right? A well-designed rain garden's also going to drain after a few days. So you wouldn't want necessarily an obligate species like a cattail unless you're going to have an area that's going to stay wet all the time. You know, like if you have like some sort of aquascape or a pond, that might be good for some of those obligate species. But facultative species, facultative wetland species will do well in a rain garden. Facultative upland species will do well enough along the border of a rain garden where it's not getting too wet for too long. But some of those facultative upland species like beautyberry can still handle, even though they might not compete well in these environments in the wild, they can still handle a little bit of water in a rain garden if long as it's just coming right after a storm and then draining pretty quickly afterwards. So strategically locate these to capture stormwater runoff. This has all kinds of benefits, but that's an entirely different talk, so I won't go too much into this. But it helps keep stormwater on the landscape for longer, gives it more time to seep down into the soil, and reduces flash flooding downstream just because it's able to keep it on the landscape. Butterfly gardens. So like I mentioned, some people, maybe don't care as much about plants, but you're really into butterflies and moths. Well, a butterfly garden is a fun thing to do. Or maybe you don't care about butterflies, but you really like birds. Well, again, butterflies and moths and their caterpillars are going to attract birds. So, having a butterfly garden is fun, especially if you have kids, especially if you're at a school, because it's going to help teach ecological principles, this connection, the food web, all sorts of things. So you have a butterfly garden, there's different things you want to consider providing. First, nectar plants. You want to provide nectar species. These are species that are going to provide that constant source of nectar throughout the growing season. So this is what they're eating. They're relying on that nectar. So butterflies are attracted to variety. So different combinations of colors and surfaces, heights, all that sort of stuff they're going to like. So some great nectar plants for butterflies. If you look at Lori Spencer's Butterflies of Arkansas, she has a great resource, and there's some information in the back on how to attract butterflies to your yard. And she lists these genera here on the right side of the screen. Now, keep in mind, these contain many species that are native to here, the Ozarks, but also a lot of other species that might be native to other parts of the country. So just make sure if you're going to pick a species in each one of these genera that you're choosing one that's native to our area. Because there are some species that butterflies love, like butterfly bush, that are not good for those butterflies. So even though you might see a lot of butterflies on them, when you'd have to ask a butterfly expert, because I'd hate to tell you the wrong thing, but there's a reason why it's just not good to plant them for the butterflies. They carry OE. Okay, gotcha.
Right.
Okay, Rosalind Emery, everybody, chapter president. There's a reason why she's our chapter president. Very knowledgeable person. Milkweeds. I mentioned milkweeds being a host plant. Host plant are those species that a butterfly or moth relies on to plant its eggs. So, there's the nectar plants, and then a lot of butterflies and moth species are tied to particular species as their host plant. But milkweeds, put this up there because just to show that there's a variety of different types of milkweeds that are native to our area, with a variety of different colors of flowers. So and they're also adapted to a variety of different habitats. So everything from open sun and well-drained areas, well, that's your butterfly milkweed. Open sun and wet areas, that's your swamp milkweed. Shady areas like under the forest, well, that's your world milkweed. So no matter what type of habitat you have, shade-wise, water-wise, there's going to be a milkweed species that can grow there. So if you want to help support those monarch populations, if you want to see monarchs, to keep in mind in the spring, they're going to eat your milkweed. So if you see that there's monarch caterpillars, a common reaction when you're new is you get excited and then you realize and you see that your milkweed plant's gone. you have to remind yourself, well, that's why you planted it. You want that caterpillar to eat it, and then so it can form its cocoon. But when they come back in the fall, they're usually just trying to book it down to Mexico. So they're looking for nectar species. And so we see a lot of monarchs on our asters in the fall out at our place. But some common milkweed species, and I've talked about some of these already, so I'll kind of blow through these. Another thing Doug Tallamy talks about is how a lot of our species will have weed in the name, and a weed is something you don't want growing somewhere, right? And so that's another problem we have with a lot of our native plants is, so he really wants to rebrand this Monarch's Delight. So I try to throw that out there. I think it's a much better name because it really describes, the role of this plant on the landscape. I'm just going to go through some of these species and kind of see what they look like. But very beautiful flowers. Yeah, it's got these green petals with these purplish looking spider looking things inside. This is world milkweed. Asclepias quadrifolia because it quadfolia, 4-leaf, world because it has a world pattern with the leaves coming off the stem. All right, I mentioned host plants. Now, these are required by a caterpillar for their growth and development. You can use host plants if you want to support long-term butterfly populations and enjoy the entire life cycle of a butterfly. Some examples include northern spicebush. This is a host plant for the spicebush swallowtail butterflies, which are very common. It was the first butterfly I learned to identify with a field guide, just because they're very, very common. And spicebush, I mean, those berries are great. You can, the leaves, twigs, all parts of the plant, you can make a tea with, and it tastes delicious. But those berries, if you let them dry out, crush them up, they can be used as an allspice substitute. My daughter and I, one fall, 2 or 3 falls ago, collected some, and then in October, and then she and my wife used them at Thanksgiving for our pumpkin pie, and it just turned out great. Pawpaws, aside from the grapefruit, is a host plant for the zebra swallowtail butterfly. So if you see a zebra swallowtail butterfly, now I think it has 1 or 2 other host plants, but there's a good chance there's a pawpaw tree nearby, at least a 1 in 3 or whatever it would be. Black cherry, the tiger swallowtail butterfly, it's a host plant for that, and the red spotted purple. We see a lot of tiger swallowtails out at our place that like to use our milkweeds as host as nectar plants, and we also have a lot of black cherry trees in our behind our house, and so I think that's one way that the reason why we see so many of them. Dutch, I'm sorry. Yeah. Yeah.
Is there a difference between a black cherry and a wild cherry?
It's a wild version of right. And there's different, the Prunus genus is that cherry genus. So there's Prunus serratina is the most common one you're going to see around here. Now there's also the Mexican plum in the same genus, the wild plums. But yeah, when it comes to common names, there's multiple common names for each plant usually. So that's why we want to always check the scientific name. But yeah, you might hear it called wild cherry. Now, other parts of the country, there's choke cherries that we don't have here, and they might call that the wild cherry there. A Dutchman's pipevine, I mentioned earlier, it's the host plant for the pipevine swallowtail butterfly. So this beautiful black caterpillar with these orange spots, and then here's the butterfly it'll produce. All right, what about native plants for birds? You can attract the birds by attracting their insects that they like to eat. Some birds will also come to feed on the plant itself or the seeds. Wild lettuce is not a particularly beautiful or attractive plant, but we have noticed that at our place, we leave it because we live out in the country, so we're able to let it look a little more wild and unkempt. But we notice each year the, what's that yellow bird? Goldfinches love to land on top of those seed heads. I'm not a bird person. I always have to be reminded. And is that a goldfinch? Okay. Thank you. Rosalind Emery, everybody. Rosalind Emery. So, they like to land on those seed heads and sit there and eat the little, this isn't wild lettuce here, but it's a very similar thing. Like to, pull out the little, looks like a thistle to me. Yeah. Likes to pull out those little white, fluffy seeds and eat those. So now hummingbirds. Flowers that have developed in response to or have evolved over years in response to hummingbirds usually have these bright red or orange flowers. The hummingbird's long bill, they're adapted to those, so they usually have these long tubular shaped, funnel shaped blossoms. So that can include this cardinal flower. One time I saw this cardinal flower in full bloom out south of Fayetteville on the White River, and there was a hummingbird flying back and forth between it and this tree, maybe 20, 30 feet away, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. It was really enjoying that cardinal flower. Rural catchfly. This is a tracked species here in Arkansas, not protected in any way or considered threatened or endangered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, but at a state level here in Arkansas, it's one that's a species of conservation concern. Indian pinks. Now, these are some very short-growing species, very beautiful, and also great for hummingbirds. I see some heads nodding out there. Then I mentioned trumpet honeysuckle earlier, one of our native honeysuckles. Is going to do a lot more for the ecosystem than Japanese honeysuckle would. Red buckeyes, this is another one. It has those red tubular flowers. All right, I throw this slide up about Osage orange living fences. You might have heard those fruits, those Osage oranges, referred to as hedge apples. And because back in the day, you could use these to plant hedgerows. So a living fence is like a fence that's alive. And you see this technique used a lot in the old world, and so it's it provides habitat, shelter for small mice or birds or all kinds of other things. And it could be used on your place as a fence that keeps if it's wide enough, too wide for like a goat to jump over, or sheep, or traditionally what they've been used for, or to keep deer out potentially. I don't know. Some people will tell you there's nothing you can do to keep deer out, but they're a challenge. We plant native things for wildlife, but then we all complain about the deer eating our native plant gardens. It's kind of a funny little paradox, but if you can look this up online, Mother Earth News had a great article on how to plant a living fence and grow a living fence with Osage orange. And I'm going to just repeat what I recall. I tried this one year. It didn't work for me, but I haven't tried it since. I don't know. I haven't thought about too much to figure out what I did wrong. But what it says in this article is you collect those Osage oranges in the fall whenever those trees are dropping it. Now, the trees are dioecious, so they're either male or female. So only the females are going to be producing these fruits. And so you collect these, you put them in a 5-gallon bucket, fill it with water, leave it outside or in your garage, let it go through some freeze thaw cycles. It'll turn into like a slurry in the springtime. You stir that up. Those freeze thaw cycles have helped it stratify. And then you dig a shallow trench where you want that fence to be, and you pour that slurry in there. Put a little thin layer of dirt on top of that, and then when it starts to sprout, you start to weave those branches. And then as it grows and lateral branches come off, you weed those back in. And over time, I don't know how long, this could be a lifetime project you're leaving for your grandkids. I don't know. I'm sure they grow faster than that, of course. But, after years, then you eventually have a nice hedgerow that's a living fence that's providing habitat, safety, and shelter. And also produces leaves in the wintertime, and might have keep that natural look to a fence versus having a barbed wire fence that might look less appealing to you. So just something to consider. You might look into living fences in general, but this is one that I found on the internet that I thought was interesting. All right, so we want to plant native plants, but where do we get them? As the supply and demand thing in our society, is kind of where the demand seems to be much higher than the supply. And we have some native plant growers in here. We have some native plant sellers. White River Nursery, you want to raise your hand? They sell native plants over there. It's just over on the east side of town. Or no, yeah, east. Always get east and west confused. Shonda, yeah, Moonlit, y'all grow native plants and sell at the Huntsville Farmers Market, but you also supply to White River Nursery. There's all kinds of nurseries popping up. The Northwest Arkansas Master Naturalist, that's a nonprofit. They have plant sales. Compton Gardens up in Bentonville. And if you sign up to be on our email list, we always try to make sure that we're notifying you of a native plant sale that's coming up. If you follow us on Facebook, we try to share the native plant sales that are happening in the area so that you can get these. And as the demand keeps growing, hopefully the supply will eventually be there to match it. Because I think what Alex has said at White River Nursery is they can't keep them quick enough. As soon as they get a new shipment of native plants, they get sold. And then people show up wanting native plants and they're out. I'm sure Shonda can't grow them quick enough. So it's just, so anyway, if you're looking to make some money, there's definitely a market need for more native plants in this area. So, the demand isn't everywhere yet either, but here it is. Don't dig plants up from the wild. Now I've transplanted, bloodroot from a friend's property. So, I'm not judging anybody, but I wouldn't recommend going and digging up an entire patch of a whole bunch of bloodroot. Definitely don't go to a state park or protected area and dig up things. Those are there to be unimpacted by humans or minimally impacted. But whenever we disturb an area in the wild, it can often leave a space that then opportunistic species like invasive species can then take over. So, we just want to be conscious of that. And wild collected plants generally don't perform as well in a garden as those that are propagated in a nursery or grown from seeds and cuttings. It's my understanding as well, but others can speak more about that than I can, better about that. Collecting seeds. We have that seed swap. Just want to be, again, don't collect from protected areas, state parks, anything like that. So a lot of people collect from roadsides that are just going to end up usually getting sprayed or mowed down. A lot of things that are underneath utility right of ways will end up getting sprayed in October. So if you see a native species there, collecting seed isn't going to kill the plant either. If it's an annual, it might not regrow there, but you're at least, and also, collecting your own seed locally, it's going to be a local source or local ecotype, which is more adapted to our local climate, local soils, than an ecotype of the same species that might be from another part of the country. However, it does take time out of your day, and not all species are going to be going to seed at the same time. So you really got to be keeping your eye on stuff. And then there's a milkweed plant down the road that, I was successful this past year, but the year before I was watching it every day as sun. Right whenever those milkweed pods were about to be ready, I went out there and they were gone. And I think maybe deer ate them. That I've heard has happened, or it's also possible there's another guy that lives near me that collects native seed, and he might have beat me to it. So, but he and I now know each other, and so we've agreed to share our seeds with each other. But so not too worried about him anymore. So, if you do collect annual seeds, make sure you always leave seeds behind, because, those seeds are feeding wildlife, especially in the wintertime. Don't take them all. A lot of people like to, especially foragers, talk about this rule of thirds. You take a third, but then you leave 2/3. You leave a third for it to repropagate itself, and you leave a third for wildlife. But the problem with that is maybe you're not the first person that's gone through there. Maybe you're taking a third of what was left, the previous 2/3 that the last person that came behind you left. So, I would just say, just only take what you need and don't take too much, and make sure you leave plenty behind, because we don't want to be impacting negatively these species in any way. So don't over collect. Always sprinkle some of those seeds on the ground too before you leave. Don't collect threatened or rare species. These are threatened and rare for a reason. They're struggling. Wherever they are, they they found their little sweet spot and they're holding on. And, and another issue Jennifer Ogle talks about is when we're propagating some of these, tend to be, it's with their genetics. Things that we're propagating and cloning, the genetics is getting affected in this garden setting, and sometimes they can cross-pollinate with the wild specimens, and we're basically making the wild specimens to where they're more adapted to like a less competitive garden setting. And so we just want to make sure that we're not impacting their hardier genetics that are more well adapted to these wild environments. It's always a catch-22. My thoughts on things like swamp milkweed, that is a species of conservation concern here in Arkansas. Well, that's really only because we're on the very southern edge of its boundary. Like north of here, they're doing just fine. So when you learn about species of conservation concern in Arkansas, you'll see its global listing or its global ranking, and then its state ranking. Its state, it might be rare, but it's just fine as a species north of here. It's swamp milkweed all over Missouri. I don't think there's too much of an issue, in my opinion, with people, since that one is a very popular one to be grown. But if it's something like Moore's delphinium, that is endemic to the Ozarks and is only known to grow in a few spots, and globally it is, threatened, we might want to be very careful. I say we should be very careful about making sure we want to conserve the wild populations, but we don't want to encourage genetic degradation. Local vendors and native plant nurseries, you're supporting local businesses, and that's a great thing too, like White River Nursery. But you always want to know where they're getting their seed from. Places like White River are great about making sure they're getting from local vendors. There are some, though, you just want to ask, well, where does the seed come from? Because they might be getting seed from way up north. Some of the downy phlox I planted in my yard, I got from Missouri Wildflower Nursery, which up there in Jefferson City. And I don't know, they could have gotten their seed from further north, of them. But I've noticed that the downy phlox at my place blooms 2 weeks after all the downy phlox, the local downy phlox blooms. And I think that's because it is adapted to a later frost date. So it's holding out, saying up here where it's from, that last frost date is later in the year. So it waits and blooms then. And so the concern with that is if it's cross-pollinating with the local downy phlox, it could be passing those genes on. And so they start blooming a little later. Well, eventually as things warm up, it might start to bloom too late for it to be able to handle the warmth. So locally sourced seed is always going to be best, the local ecotypes. But again, there's an issue with the supply and the demand, right? The supply. So we do the best we can too. So, there's this ideal that we try to strive for, but, we do the best we can. Online vendors, probably gonna have a wider selection of availability, but probably not locally sourced, that seed. So just be careful. So, check the content of your quote unquote wildflower seed mix very carefully, because I've noticed on some wildflower seed mixes, it'll say milkweed species, black-eyed Susan species, doesn't say anything else. There's a lot of milkweed species that aren't native to Arkansas or the Ozarks, that by planting them here, they either might not grow because we don't have the right conditions, or they might be confusing those monarchs about where they are in their migration paths. So make sure your plants or seeds are purchased from that you're purchasing come from as close to the place you're going to plant them as possible. That's the ultimate goal here. Now, hopefully the supply in the area, a lot of growers are very aware of that and trying to make sure. Now, if you're ever wondering if your package arrives and it says things like fragile on there, you can probably assume that it's probably not locally sourced. All right. I'm running low on time. Sorry, everybody. We'll try to blow through this. Yeah, this program is a lot longer than I could talk about in an hour. But cold stratification, some of your species are going to need to go through a cold period. So you want to either seed those species in the fall, or make sure you're cold stratifying them to grow indoors. A lot of species, though, don't require this, and so you can plant them in the spring, or you can still plant them in the fall. The cold stratification won't harm them, but that's something to look into. Scarification, that embryo of that exterior of the seed needs to be weakened for some species, so there's different ways to do that. So this is something to look more into. Sowing seeds, let's see, seed mix. Legumes are always good. Perennials, like I said, most won't bloom for till the second or third year. You can buy plants that are already being grown by growers and sold in our local nurseries, and transplant these. These are going to be your best bet for success, because a lot of things you seed, they'll get eaten by wildlife, or they just won't germinate, or for whatever reason. Trees and shrubs, transplant them usually late fall, or when they're dormant's good, or in the fall. So they can start putting out some root systems before they go dormant. It's usually great. It's less of a shock to the plant than if you try to do it in the growing season. Well, just avoid summer. All right, maintaining native plants. You definitely want to water them during the first year, but usually after established, they're going to take a lot less water. So they can be pretty drought tolerant. Now, they might not bloom if you're not watering them, because they're like, oh, okay, I don't have enough energy put into reproduction. But I mean, when we've had some really bad droughts, you know, my native plants, I don't water them once they're established, and they bloom less, but they do just fine. They come back the next year. They're not hurt. You know, but there are some like ironweed that seem to be pretty drought tolerant. And, you know, they'll bloom during our bad drought like we had in the last few summers. You know, you can mow it once a year in the fall if you would like, or you can leave it standing. Control invasive noxious species, and if you're able to, do a little controlled burn. That's always going to help eradicate some of the non-native species that you have growing there. Now, how do we manage our neighbors, right? Because not everybody agrees with what we're doing. You know, a lot of native gardens can look, a lot of people have this idea of a native garden or a wild prairie yard, you know, it just is an eyesore. Well, start small, expand gradually. You know, it's easier to get neighborhood acceptance when your transition is gradual. Maybe start by planting around a tree or along a fence row, and just every year expand out, and, you know, like the frog in boiling water or whatever, you know, then your neighbors, you know, if they could see what you're doing, maybe they'll be on board with it. Create borders and edges. You know, this helps it look well-defined. Makes it look intentional. You know, it creates a sense that yard is being managed and not just overrun and out of control. You know, contours and berms, you know, this helps. Connecting pathway, you know, might be helpful. Put a little bench out there. Maybe you can sit on that bench and enjoy your hummingbirds and whatever else, butterflies that are out there, just the blooms, and, you know, enjoy a little piece in your native plant garden. You know, the important thing is to make it look intentional. Don't do like me at my yard where I got it looking wild. You know, I'll be out there watering something I just planted. I planted some liatris last year, and you know, if you saw my yard, you wouldn't know that I've put a lot of time and effort to get it to look that way. I'll tell you that much. Yeah, but I was out there watering it, and a neighbor drives by in her truck, rolls down her window and stops. And is like, "You watered your weeds?" I explain, "Oh, I planted this thing. When it grows, it'll have this nice, tall, purple flower. It's going to look awesome." And she's, "Oh, okay, that sounds nice." So, but I imagine a lot of people that drive by probably just think I'm crazy. And that's okay. I wish they weren't growing their fescue and Bermuda lawns. So, just basic, but don't be this person. You know, I just pulled this off of Google Images. I hope this is nobody's house in this room, and I'm sure it's just an abandoned house. But, you know, it's a lawn grass, non-native grass, probably. That, you know, people do take advantage of the gardening for wildlife movement and just try not to mow their lawn and say, "Oh, I'm creating habitat." You know, there are, you know, Fayetteville, you can apply for a permit to have a native yard. I think they just have certain limitations on that to, you know, prevent issues. But, I mean, the only habitat this is providing, maybe shelter for small prey or rodents, snakes, you know, but not doing a whole lot for pollinators or anything like that. It's not supporting. There's not much biodiversity. It's just one species. It's probably a non-native species like fescue, or maybe maybe not. But anyway, it's just, you know, biodiversity is going to be important. All right, so, you know, just want to leave you with this last, you know, 3 questions to ask yourself when you're considering what to plant. Is it beneficial to the local ecosystem? If yes, then stop right there. If not, no, is at least not harmful. Non-native species aren't all bad. You know, there's a lot of them that will still provide nectar for butterflies. There are plenty of non-native species that don't naturalize in the area, and there are plenty of that do naturalize, but that don't become invasive. So, you know, if as long as it's not harmful in any way, maybe it could be neutral. That's, you know, your second maybe tier of species to choose. But if it is harmful, if it is doing damage to the local ecosystem in some way, harming species, taking over areas and taking away their food, you know, then just ask yourself, well, why are you planting it? You know, that's all I ask, is that you just ask yourself that question. You know, maybe you have a good reason, but I imagine if you're somebody who cares, you probably wouldn't be sitting in here right now. Right. So, if you want to learn more, Doug Tallamy, I mentioned him earlier, has some great books out there. There's another one he has up here called The Oaks, and just talks about, if you're going to plant a tree for biodiversity, the oaks are going to support the greatest number of butterfly and moth populations. So he's done some studies. You know, he's a scientist up in I think Delaware, but, you know, kind of kickstarted this latest wave that we're in. I mean, planting natives, this isn't the first time this has come around. It was popular 100 years ago. It got popular again in the 70s. You know, we're kind of in the third or maybe fourth wave. This time, though, it seems to have really, especially as our world has changed so much over the past 100 years, has really become a it seems to be, I say it seems to be doing better, but it's not like I was around to experience the previous waves. I just assume maybe it is. Some other books that are a little more on the design side of things, A Living Landscape and Garden Revolution. These two books are more on the science about why you should do this stuff. These are a little more on how to design your garden, different ideas for you, that sort of thing. Planting in a Post-Wild World, another design-oriented book, but then Benjamin Vogt, I think that's how you say his name, A New Garden Ethic, a great book, just on, why we're doing this. And then Wild Ones, we do have a yard certification program. You can go to our website. We've done some recent rebranding with our logo, so I think they've put these on hold temporarily, but I invite you to certify your yard, and there's other ones beyond Wild Ones. And it's just a fun, way to work towards certain goals, or to put a sign out by the road to explain to passersby why you're doing what you're doing, so people maybe understand, oh, okay, this is a certified butterfly garden, or this is certified by National Wildlife Federation's wildlife habitat, that sort of thing. And then homegrown national parks. This is a thing started, I think, by Doug Tallamy, and you can go in there and register your property and what you're doing there, or you can look at who else in this area is doing similar things on their property. But the whole idea is there's the amount of acreage taken up by homes and residential areas is about equivalent to the amount of acreage taken up by national parks. So if we were to all be planting these species on our properties, and we could probably have not the same level of biodiversity impact as the national park system is doing with preserving these special areas. But we can at least, there's a lot of potential that we all have. We have that power ourselves to make small changes, and then cumulatively these small changes add up. An example of that, I live next to I live between Devil's Eyebrow Natural Area and Pea Ridge National Park, where they're doing a lot of quail habitat restoration and prairie restoration. And we just have less than an acre, like 0.8 or 0.79 acres. Technically, it's not very much. And but we plant a lot of native species out there, and like I said, I keep it wild looking. And of course, we've always seen the butterflies and birds and other wildlife out there. But a few falls ago, 2 or so ago, we had a covey of quail that we saw just 3 different times, just moving around out there in different places. And so I think we were getting some residual benefits of where we live, but it just let me know that my space is not very big. It itself is not able to support quail populations, but it exists within the context of a larger landscape that can, because of other things that are going on. And so, I'm not saying that we're going to bring quail into the center of Fayetteville, but you think about other species that we might start to see here again, like the Diana fritillary butterfly, if we can, have enough violets in this area again. And again, if you want to learn more about Wild Ones, our local chapter, we're on social media. I invite you to go onto our Facebook page and like our page. We'll post all kinds of information, articles. We share all kinds of other things, plant sales happening. You want to learn about our future events. We have an Instagram account, our chapter YouTube channel. During the pandemic, we're giving a lot of webinars, and so we have a lot of information on there. And then our national YouTube channel. I'll tell you, if you go to YouTube, you type in Wild Ones, you're going to get a lot of different unrelated results. So type in Wild Ones Ozark chapter, or type in Wild Ones channel. And then, like I said, there's other chapters have their YouTube channels. Other chapters also have their websites on the national page, Wild Ones page, and you can get to and they do all kinds of great information on these other chapters have too, so that will apply to our region. So it's just a great resource. You don't even have to be a member to go onto our website. I just invite you to go check that out. So, and to join, again, members.wildones.org/join. If you're on limited income or a student, you can join for as low as $25. The next level up, I think, is a household, which I believe is 40, and that covers 2 adults and all children in the home. But there's different tiers. So there's the wild, which is 40. Then, there's wilder and wildest. So, if you're feeling really wild, you can, pay the $100 tier. It doesn't get you anything extra. It's just more money goes to pay our national staff, which is a small staff. And then part of your dues comes to our chapter. So we have to support all of the marketing that our people at the national level do, and getting people like Doug Tallamy give webinars and all that sort of thing. So, and with that, sorry it went a little long, but